There's so much about this book that I love. First and foremost, the writing, so gorgeous. So that'll be for your experience to read. I thought what I try to do tonight is boil down some of the bigger themes in the book and talk to Anya and maybe find out some things you would not necessarily know reading the book. And then I'm also just going to be very sensitive about not giving away too many spoilers, because while this isn't a book written as a suspense, it's very suspenseful because as an artist, you really live your life on the high wire, I would say. I'm really an editor and an agent. I live behind the desk and I admire people like you, and I don't know how you do it. So I'd like to kind of get into that a little bit, but everything in this book, in my opinion, begins with place, and the place is the Holler. And I think most of you know that that's in Appalachia and it's in Southeast Kentucky, and it's where you spent your summers. And from the first moment I read about the Holler, I wanted to know everything about it. So I'm just going to ask Anya to read this maybe 2 pages about the Holler.
So the suspense in the, as with any memoir, if the person lives to tell the tale, you know how it ends. You already, you know the ending. How you get there. Eventually, the area my family lived in, Fugit's Fork, became known as Ganderbill Holler, named for the rock formation at its head that looks like a goose beak. At least that's what Mamaw said. The mouth of Ganderbill begins where several delicate creeks, known as branches, trickle out of the hills and converge below Ramhole Holler. At its deepest, the creek is 2 feet and 10 at its widest. Ganderbill is about a mile long, twisting up past Pheasant Holler, near the cave where my ancestors spent their first frigid winter in the mid-1700s, near Mean Wolf Pen Holler, where someone tried to trap some wolves that were stealing livestock. Past Deep Holler and wrapping itself near Little Brook, the cold creek where Old Man Gran washed his face every morning. Little Brook guards my mother's favorite wild plum tree and sits just below Peddler's Rock, named for a long-dead coonhound. It's not far from Terrapin Station Point, a spot on the hill up behind the shack where season after season terrapins come to mate, humping and heaving on one another's hard shells. Somewhere on the hill is where my old man Gran's father, apathetic about the Civil War, which Granny always called that awful Silver War, was shot and killed by marauding Yankees while he was milking his cow. Also up there is where a Fugit cousin was hanged by his tongue by locals for talking to the enemy. Farther up the creek, Ganderbill meets an old horse path that takes you over by River Caney and past the old Cherokee burial ground to the Fugit family cemetery at Low Gap Holler, where Old Man Gran, Granny, Ed, and Mamaw are buried. My mother knew this land by heart, and from her earliest years, she knew that one day she would inherit it. She drew maps of her hills and hollers in the dirt by the coal bank, a 4-foot thick seam from which she and Mamaw hauled coal in galvanized steel buckets, rain or shine, sleet or snow. Her first lesson in geography was the Holler. She memorized its drainage chain like a nursery rhyme. Ganderbill Holler empties into Lost Creek. Lost Creek empties into Troublesome Creek. Troublesome Creek flows into the South Fork of the Kentucky River, which flows into the Kentucky River proper, which flows into the Ohio River, which flows into the Mississippi River, around the Delta, and empties into the Gulf of Mexico, which empties into the Atlantic, which rushes around the great big world.
I know it's a far cry from New Haven as far as I can tell, and we get to see this incredible place steeped in history through this little girl's eyes, who for the rest of the years, you know, is grown up in Westport with a Jewish dad and sort of regular suburban life, and these 2 identities begin to take form. And I think that's where, when I was also reading this book, I thought, how does one become an artist? You know, how does it really happen? And I think, in my experience working with writers and not visual artists primarily, that it does start in childhood, and it does start from sort of what's in your backyard, but also how you apprehend that. And in this memoir, Anya does something that I've really not seen anyone else do, which is she doesn't whitewash her story or what's happened, and how this divide of living in these two places doesn't become a split personality. That's not the right term, but this sort of inner life and outer life that you're both showcasing and hiding at the same time. And there's another little passage about being a child and trying to understand oneself. And I think it's somehow a little bit of a bridge to becoming an artist, that I'll just mention this favorite little sentence of mine, in which you write, "My favorite artist right now," I think you're around 10 or so, "I think my favorite artist right now is Winslow Homer, because I didn't know that waves could have feelings." It's beautiful. Right? Yeah. Okay. Explain. You're the artist. What was that? What was that like for you?
Well, I remember that we had in my art room in elementary school, we had Mrs. Kelly, who always was chain smoked cigarettes and hung around the outside of her room, just smoking cigarette after cigarette. She had these posters, and one of them was Winslow Homer, and there was the man, you know, the iconic image of the man looking over his shoulder, rowing the boat through the huge wave. And I remember sitting at my little, you know, on my little stool with the clay dust all over the front and looking at it and thinking, wow, that is something else. And just wondering, how did he do that? Like, why is that is a painting? I know that is flat. I know that is a bulletin board that we stick, you know, construction board on, and I know we stick like the little leaves on at Thanksgiving, but this is like, it's like real television. And it's like the TV, but it's better, and it stays still, but when it stays still, I also kind of see it moving. And I just remember that feeling, and every time I would come and I would sit in the same, you know, you had art in this, so Mrs. Kelly I had for 4 years, and the poster never moved. Winslow Homer was always there, which is probably a testament to the enthusiasm she had for her classroom. But it's probably why we saw her outside smoking so many cigarettes. But you know, I would come and I would sit in the same place and I would stare at it, and over time, you know, I think to my little elementary school mind, you know, it was growing and changing at the same time that I was growing and changing, and sort of the constancy of this image at the same time that I was changing and having different experiences sort of deepened that image and what it meant for me.
And then around the same time, your I think your grandmother on your father's side gives you a very serious book about one of your favorite artists, Toulouse-Lautrec. And she asks you, she asked me what I thought of one of his paintings of women. I told her that I liked the way he made things ugly, but also pretty at the same time. She told me that meant I was a real artist, because I could hold a contradiction in my head. And I just, first of all, that a 10-year-old would have that take on the Lautrec is incredible, but also this whole idea of holding contradictions in one's head, and certainly your sort of dual life in these two places from a very young age, you have to piece all that together. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the contradictions of being a, as you call it, a Jew Billy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that idea of the contradiction is is really interesting, and especially that I kind of voiced that through the connection with my grandmother, my Jewish grandmother, who's from Connecticut. She was an artist. She was the first sort of true encounter I had with art. She made very colorful, bright, vibrant paintings. And for much of my childhood, and she made many paintings about our family, about our ancestors, and about our recent. So for me, many people who had passed away somewhat recently, but she often painted them without faces. And one of the things that I really took from that was that there was a specificity to where we're from, because there was this gesture, but there also was this kind of universality to that. And so I think when I was, growing up looking at her paintings, and also, kind of talking to her about it, I felt very adult when we would talk about it. I felt very much like, I remember when she handed me the Toulouse-Lautrec book, and I knew this is an adult book. This is a heavy book with small writing, and and she had it on her shelf, and she's a real artist. This means something. And I remember looking at those images and thinking, what is this? Why is this art? Why does Maya have this book? And why, and what connection is it to the pictures that she's making? And I think studying those types at a young age, studying those types of contradiction, why does she make paintings of our family, but they don't have faces? Like, what could that mean? And the idea of just sort of metaphor and symbol, I think, became something that I was very interested in at a young idea, and were presented with at a young age. And so I think one of the things that you see in the book is this sort of symbolism of, being split or being in two. And I think that I started to be able to see very directly that I was also this sort of creature who was going back and forth and sort of moving back and forth between two places, but also that they weren't so split sometimes. Like in my parents' relationship, they were from, totally different places, totally different, upbringings, different speech patterns. Like they had really very little, if you look at it, their relationship, very, very little reference points towards one another. Yet living with them meant that I was living in that kind of contradiction and seeing how that kind of beauty and ugly could come together in the same place. Sort of every day, seeing those two things. Not to say that one side is beautiful, one is ugly, but that they were a contradiction, right? And they lived it out. And my sister and I were a contradiction. And two things that aren't supposed to happen, right? Like a Jew and a hillbilly, somebody who is from the sort of upper middle class background, and somebody who is, a poor person from the hills, are not supposed to meet. So I think that kind of symbolism sort of lived in me and found its outlets and observations through other parts of my life.
Very good. So then I'm also so fascinated. How does somebody first identify as an artist? I think having one's grandmother sort of tap you on the head and say, you are a real artist. Do you remember taking that forward? Did you ever remember a time where you said, I am an artist, or I want to be an artist? And then that's going to sort of lead me to this little section that this sort of blew me away. As I said, I've worked with a lot of memoirs, and I always feel people really try to make themselves look really good in their own memoirs, even when they're being open about the most raw parts of their life. Somehow you still think that they're incredibly elegant or something. And then along comes our Holler Rat, who's just really so honest about the experience of being an artist. And I think this little section speaks to some of that childhood fascination with self and becoming. So tell me if I'm going somewhere with this. Yeah.
I became obsessed with the idea that every scab, every piece of peeling skin was the beginning of a barnacle baby infestation. Soon, every morning began with a thorough scraping of my body, starting with the bottoms of my feet and ending with a thorough investigation of my scalp. Any bump or scab was picked. It went like this: examine the soles of the feet, scrape, rip off the toenails, poke tonsils, bite my fingernails, dig into the way back of my nostrils, rip out an eyebrow hair, search the surface of my scalp for scabs, pluck them off, and rub the center of my chest until I almost bled.
I've never really heard of a better definition of what making art is all about, honestly, than that. And I wanted to sort of talk about how that sort of apprehension of your own body, how you eventually became a performance artist, and how you sort of connected your body with creating art. And then we'll learn sort of later talk about how you eventually took that into writing. But there's this whole, to my mind, very mysterious part of your life that you talk about the projects that you do in the book. And I was just wondering if you could sort of talk about the process of how you even first conceived of doing a piece of performance art, and how it came from this dual background and this self-examination and all these ideas swirling together.
I think something that you'll encounter in the book if you read it is that one of the things that I had when I was a child is I had a major medical trauma. And one of the things that was affected was my leg. And because of that, I had a lot of sort of poking and prodding on my body at a young age. And, many things kind of came out of that, of which, the book deals with some of that. But one of the things, along with intensive dance training, was that I developed a relationship with my body that I think was perhaps a little bit more both disconnected and connected than maybe I think, like, I would say the normal people out there have. And it felt like, kind of like the doctors did, it felt like my body was something to be examined or to be kind of used or dug into. And at the same time, I was also having a lot of, at the point in the book that you're talking about, I also was having, some trauma that was radiating from some of those experiences, of those early childhood experiences. And I think that, I didn't really connect the element of trauma to art making for quite a while. It took really until I was in graduate school, where I started as a photographer. I started as a black and white traditional analog photographer that was working with a very, kind of old-fashioned camera in black and white darkroom stuff. And by the first thing that I kind of really did, and this talks about this in the book, was once I sort of cast off the sort of kind of heavy history of black and white photography that I deeply wanted to embed myself in, was I started working with my body. And the first thing I did was I actually made a series of photographs called Jew Billy, where I dressed up and photographed myself as a sort of what I called typical Jewish American princess, and what I called typical like white trash woman. And these are probably very offensive photographs now to look at, but it was the first time that I actually kind of dealt with the presence of my body and the presence of my identity, or what my identity might be if you looked at it from on paper. And I think that kind of opened up doors to then say, okay, who am I really? And to let the skin, if I take all of my clothes off, which there was a period of a lot of naked performances, but as you would expect from performance, so there's sort of a phase that we all go through, but and some of us don't stop, but what did it mean to bear it all? What does bearing it all mean, right? What does it actually mean to be, who are you if you are unprotected with your clothing? Who are you if you are totally, totally, if you're totally open? So I went from entering a graduate school program where I brought in this, very sepia toned sort of manicured portfolio of images, actually of East Kentucky, of my relatives in East Kentucky. And I graduated with a thesis where the entire thesis was me sitting naked in a huge gallery, staring at the 200 people who were there until somebody said, essentially, what the hell's going on? And I said, I'm just here to see if you have any questions. And people got very, very upset because this was a process, a year-long thesis process where people had been painting in the studio for a year and painting, you know, pictures, et cetera, et cetera. And here I was saying, you got any questions? And they sat there for 2 hours and asked me questions. Everything from, you know, what's the capital of Minnesota, to why are you making us look at your breasts, to how is this art, to, you know, and it was called, the piece was called Self-Evidence. And after I left, this 2-hour recording, audio recording, was left for a week in the gallery. And it was very controversial at the time, but that was really, I still sort of stay at that point. I mean, I think I've developed in many ways as an artist, but I think that aspect of laying your identity there, laying your body there, is kind of where I connect to that passage now.
I thought I would ask Anya to read one more passage, which I have called the Artist Manifesto. It's a catalog of some of your artwork, and this just blows my mind. As we were, you know, talking before, I've always lived my life behind the desk, and I've always looked, you know, behind the bakery glass of people who could really manifest their art. And so I'd love you to read this, and then we could just talk a little bit about moving from performance art to writing and finding your visual voice, and then your writerly voice, and then open it up to questions. Sounds good.
So this section is when after I've cast off sort of the heavy mantle of black and white sort of documentary type photography, and I'm in a graduate program at Georgia State in Atlanta. I started to embrace the freedom of not giving a fuck. I vowed that any whim I had and could afford to enact, I would indulge. I didn't realize it then, but I was starting to perform in front of the camera. I smeared cake frosting all over my face, then filmed myself throwing rainbow sprinkles into my eyes. I made my first iteration of a piece called Jubilee, 9 portraits of me dressing up like a proverbial white trash girl, then followed by 9 portraits of me changing into a Jap woman. I photographed myself holding up signs with each of my imagined married names for every boy I ever had a crush on, then arranged all 49 images in a huge grid. I photographed myself all blurry and smudgy in suburban strip mall parking lots, their strange blend of businesses and vacant spaces, a metaphor for my confusion. I thought of all the nasty things people had said to me about my body and made photographic responses, smearing cottage cheese on the back of my thighs and turning myself into a frog. Then I jumped off the page and into the third dimension by making objects that performed. I shellacked green peas onto abandoned baby dolls, like the ones Mamaw kept on her bed, their covered bodies emerging diseased and deformed. I taught myself how to cast resin and made rubber molds on my porch. I created a thick, clear penis with small babies swimming in the shaft. When I went to shake hands with people at gallery openings, I would place the penis in their palm. I dipped a granny bra in granny panties in polyurethane, then attached more miniature plastic babies all over them. Babies were the ultimate barnacles, that childhood image that had electrified my nightmares about Dr. X. I discovered that my long embedded rituals of scratching and picking found form and some relief when I created protective, hard crusts around objects. Then I took a leap from making things to making me. I vaulted from making 3D objects to becoming a performer in space myself, often using objects I made. I fashioned undulating sculptural waves out of chicken wire and canvas, covered everything in Bondo filler, and then shaped them around a child's bed and added 30,000 miniature big plastic babies. I slept in the bed in the gallery over 2 weekends, babies attacking me on the walls. I stockpiled old Operation board games from yard sales, then filmed myself being repeatedly electrocuted while I tapped the right thigh of the imaginary patient on the game board. I photographed every single item I owned, including the buttons and pins and dull razor blades, a nod to Mamaw's collections of gimcrack. These pictures were hung in huge grids and took up an entire gallery. I photographed all my rejection letters from schools and magazines and art contests. I hung them in a coffee shop so everyone could witness my ambition and subsequent rejection. I covered myself from head to toe with 15 pairs of pantyhose, stood in front of my classmates and slowly ripped each pair off with a nail I had hidden in my palm. Each layer that was removed made a projection image on my body became clear. I recorded the sound of the nylon being ripped and my panting as I struggled to breathe under the fabric. I wanted to smother, encrust, consume. If I could unpeel myself, survive picking off the scabs, the barnacles. If I could survive my wounds, I could regrow myself and I might survive.
Thank you. So how do you survive becoming a writer?
Barely. Writing has been a very intense journey. Obviously I was an English major in college. I've written all my life. I'm the child of an English professor and writer. But it wasn't really my thing. Like it wasn't really, other people were writers. I kind of chose the visual art path. I chose performance art. It wasn't really a choice. Like I just didn't gravitate in that direction. There were a couple sort of significant events that happened in my life, which made it such that I didn't really have the performance art community around me. So one of the things about performance is that you really need people to watch you. You really need people to like invite you into their weird lofts to do things. And without that, like if you're like living in Milford in sort of the sketchy part of Milford, like you can't really go down to like Silver Sand State Park and like be doing stuff and expect like a kind of interesting response, but like response is going to push your work. So I sort of found myself without a community and without performance opportunities, and also getting into the city and sort of seeing my friends and seeing that became harder and harder. And it's one of those sort of communities that like the less you're around, it's kind of like the less you're around, nobody's really remembering you or thinking like, oh, we should call her from where does she live, Connecticut, so I had the idea that I would just sort of write about what was going on. There was no idea of becoming a writer. There was no idea of like changing genre or in any way adopting a new artistic identity. It was simply that I just needed a creative outlet. And I was honestly like kind of alone in this crummy place. And I thought, well, maybe I could join like a writing class. Like maybe there's a writing class at the library, or maybe there's some other people who are sort of like a little bit bored. And I wasn't bored, but like a little needy. And they also are starting to write. And I was very lucky that in Westport, there was the Westport Writers Workshop, which, is kind of a community writing center. And I joined a writing class there, which was very, I would say, low stakes. Like I think had I stayed in New York City, I'm sure I would never have written a book because I would have been too intimidated, too afraid. I would have gone to events like this and then heard of somebody's bio and been like, oh, you can't do that. And so it's so scary. But in this environment, it was very supportive. It was very nurturing. And I just kept going because honestly, I liked having friends, meeting people and talking about writing. And from that, I sort of started to think, well, what is a writer? Like, does a writer have to really, go to Iowa? Does a writer have to live in New York City and Brooklyn? Like, maybe they don't have to do that. And then I would always think to myself, well, Stephen King lives in Maine. Stephen King lives in Maine, and he seems to be a writer, right? And I would collect sort of stories of other people who lived in places, like maybe they didn't live in San Francisco or like in a necessarily cool place, but they were writers too. And it made me feel better about living in Milford. One thing, like I could be a writer. I live in Milford. I could be the writer from Milford, Connecticut. And So I still don't adopt that title, like, even though I'm like very proud to have written a book. I think of this book as a piece of performance art. And I think that, you know, one of the things for me was I never really used words in my performance ever until I started writing this, in which case I started using some of the pieces of this as text for performances that I did, you know, the occasional performances I would get. And it felt really strange, sometimes good, but sometimes sort of like, oh, this isn't really me. Like I actually like to play with silence, and I like to play with gesture. And I think things coming from my dancing background of liking to sort of elongate moments in a way that I felt like I couldn't do with words, because sometimes a word is one syllable and then it's just, you're hanging there and hanging there. So for me, when I started writing, and I ultimately, I didn't realize it was a book, I would say, and that sounds like, oh, I didn't know I was writing a book, but I did. But I really didn't. I thought I was, you know, kind of passing time and exploring emotions. It wasn't therapeutic, but I was like, well, this is kind of interesting. I haven't thought about that in a while. And the group of people I was with were actually the ones who were like, my goal is to write a book. And it was sort of joining them in their kind of journey that I thought, you know, oh, well, maybe I could do that too. I didn't have really an aspiration for it will be a book in a bookstore that you will look at and see it for a while. But when I got that aspiration, it came on hard. And I was like, what do I have to do? I'm going to bring the Yale student to this game, and I'm going to study every single step, and I'm going to, you know, do it the best. I'm going to be the best. I'm going to be the top of the class. But I think as a writer, it's very interesting because it's very different, and writers are seemingly very different from artists. And when I go to places, like I was just at the Mississippi Book Festival this past weekend, which was great, but it was a lot of writers, and the way writers socialize with one another is very, or the ones that I've seen, is very different than the way artists socialize. We're just kind of like messy and sort of, you know, just the artists I know, our heads kind of sort of flop all over the place, but the writers are very, some of them are much more precise. They're much more restrained, I would say, and much more kind of, their eyes are sort of like, you know, you just tell them kind of like taking it all in. And it feels a little more dangerous, like being around them. Like you don't know if they're going to kind of jump out and like say whatever, take whatever you said and put it in a book. Because, you know, artists, it's a little bit more like, yeah, what do you think about that? That's cool. Yeah. It's a little bit, I guess, sort of more like Cheech and Chong in general. But I do think of this as a performance. I do think of it as a way of time unfolding. And if you're reading and you stop at page 38 and you stop at page 48, or you don't even get going, or you look at the book and you're like, there, you know, that each of you have had an individual experience involving time. And each of you have had a kind of intimate encounter with the content or with the physical form of it. And that is a moment that is ephemeral, and which is just the same thing as performing or as standing in front of the stage and having your own kind of, perhaps it's cathartic, perhaps it's boring, perhaps it's, you know, it engages you in some way or makes you think in a different way, which is just the same as performance. And also the cool thing is you're reading, I get to be silent while you're encountering it.
I think this could be a good time to kind of move into question and answer. So if anybody has questions, go ahead.
Can you speak a little bit to the process of putting together the cover?
Oh yeah, sure. So the picture here is actually the picture on the cover. So there's some photographs in the book that I took, and that are kind of representative of some of the type of work I was doing at the time of that documentary work. Most of the documentary work had people in the picture, but I chose some images that didn't have people in them. And of course, because it's, you know, on newsprint, it's not like the, you know, the best, you know, reproduction of them, but it is pretty good. I sent a couple pictures of myself in Kentucky when I was a little kid. And that picture that is on the cover, actually, I was sort of surprised they chose it, is picture that is taken by my father, although he doesn't seem to remember it, but where I was in the cornfield, and I was in cornfield, and I was on top of my mom's shoulders, sort of pretending to be the scarecrow. And so they really liked that. They really liked the green color of it. The like handwritten Holler Rat was all their invention. What I did, and what like my input to the cover was to say, this is the feeling I wanted to have. I wanted to feel kind of messy. I wanted to feel like an artist made it. I want it to look kind of like it's something. I don't want it to look like a book that's in a black and white picture where you see a book and it's like, oh, this is about something old. And it seems like whenever you see a book about Appalachia, it's very often like, here's an old farm machinery, and here's somebody in a 1940s cotton dress who's sort of looking, you know, woe-begotten. And I was like, I absolutely do not want that. And I wanted it to be colorful and looking like it's something inviting to read. And my favorite colors are purple and green. As you can see, I'm wearing some purple and green today. And so I really wanted it to have the feeling of something that was kind of messy, because that was sort of conveyed how I felt. But in terms of the end product, like, they were just great graphic designers. Abrams, who published it, Abrams is a art publisher. That's their like legacy, and they are really good at graphic design.
They actually play with the photograph and added the embellishments and the scribbles and things like that.
All of that.
Your
Yeah,
permission, obviously, to some.
I mean, they get to do, you know, they get to do what they want. I mean, I had final approval on it, but I just love what they did. And everybody that saw it was like, yes, that's it. So
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Where does the title come from? Well, obviously Holler, but the rat part, how does that come about?
well, you will find out on the first page. I will say that the original title was Jubilee, which is what my father's little nickname for my sister and I. Which I always like because it was also like Jubilee. You added like maybe put a little accent on it, and then like, you know, like the Queen, her Jubilee. It was actually Betsy who said that she didn't think that there would be any publisher who would publish a book called Jubilee. And because I was saying, I don't know if you know the book Pre-Study, but there was a kind of fad for a while of sort of these sort of Pre-Study was one of them. And I know that there's a book that just came out, which is Boy Slut, which I think tests the boundaries. But Betsy was the Holler Rat. Betsy was the one who said, you know, I believe it was in an email when you said, we're referring to, I don't know if you remember, but you said, our little Holler Rat we were talking about. And that was the first time I was like, oh, maybe that could work. And I didn't, and I in the sort of lead up to this book, I tried to, you know, you've got to do social media, you got to do Instagram, you got to do Facebook and all these things. And it was the first time I sort of actually started to embrace or play with what that might mean. Like whether it's like music choice that goes along with some weird picture, or, and actually came to be quite fond of it.
Anya, can you just tell us, what were your impressions at a young age when you transitioned from Milford down to Appalachian?
Oh, well, you mean Westport. From when I grew up in Westport, I later in 2015, I moved to Milford for a short period of time. What were my impressions? Well, you know, it's something that's completely normal in my life. So it was just, you know, I've been going since I was a tiny baby. So it was just something that we did. We got in the car or we got on a plane and we, you know, drove to see Mamaw in Ganderville. So there was never any sense of it being weird or, odd. If anything, I think the fact that occasionally, later in life, somebody would say, oh, well, where's your family is from? Oh, huh. That was the weird part. It was just so natural to me. I mean, my family is extremely loving, extremely, funny, extremely caring. It's just that's my mom's family. We go there. There's Mamaw. She's gonna, we're coming. She's gonna make my favorite, fried potatoes. We're gonna go to, the dollar store, our lovely dollar store. We're gonna do the things that we do just the same way any other kid would go visit their grandparents in Florida and go to, get their Slurpee at the 7-Eleven. We had our kind of rituals. I think that as I grew older, this was something that was reflected back to me actually in an email I got from a high school history teacher who had read it, who said, you never mentioned, was fairly close to in high school, he said, you never mentioned that. I never heard you mention that. I never heard you talk about that in debate, or we were for government. You never talked about, social services or welfare, any of your experience in that aspect. So this comes as a complete surprise to me that you had this side of your life, which to me, I was never anything I ever thought that I hid. I think that, occasionally I was made fun of it when I was a little kid in elementary school. And I think maybe that was where I sort of stopped becoming conscious of talking about it. And definitely I think in middle school and high school, my identity was very wrapped up in being a performer, first in dance and then a little bit more and then in modern dance and theater, I would say. So I don't think that there was anything, but I did, like in high school, I wore a pair of overalls and I often wore clothes from like the feed store that my grandmother would send me. But, the way they were interpreted on a, once you put Doc Martens on and once you wore like a thick flannel on, and were interpreted by somebody who, was going to New York City all the time for dance classes, was interpreted as like, oh, she must be really like hip and cool. Like little did they know that like where they came from the Jackson feed store, right? But they were deeply unironic. And I don't think that my grandmother Mamaw knew when she put them in a box and sent them to me that they were going to be looked at in that context. I think she just was like, why does she want extra L, overalls? Who knows? She's a bit strange. Like,
So this is a great journey and an evolution. So do you have any idea what your next mistake is going to be?
Oh, wow. Sure, there are plenty of them in my future, judging by the past. I don't know. I'm working on, I spent April in a studio. So I've been making alongside the time that I've been writing this book. At the same time, I've also been making performances for camera, and partly also because we had the pandemic, but also partly because I, really don't have that live theater outlet live performance outlet quite as much. So I've been going into doing residencies where I've been going into studios and kind of using it as a laboratory where making a performance, but the performance is sort of an entire month of time in the studio where I'm bringing objects or bringing items that I kind of want to activate, and then creating sort of small film vignettes through that, and then taking that material, which now I think this last project from April, I have about probably 36 hours of sort of decent material that I filmed myself doing things, right? That I film, I light, I don't, there's not really direction for directing, but like that I made mostly of myself doing things. Sometimes that doesn't always mean you're seeing my body. Sometimes I'm manipulating something, or I'm arranging something, or there's something on the wall that's being created. And then I take that footage and I edit that into what I'm calling like a performance film, a feature film. That will then, I start out with it not having any narrative. I'm not interested in narrative, but that it becomes And I'm not interested in it. I just wrote a memoir and I'm not interested in it. And it's usually silent, so it's also silent. And so then showing those as experimental films. So that's kind of what I'm looking forward to next. I've also been writing some pieces that are sort of tangentially, memoir pieces that are sort of tangentially connected to Florida. And I have, but I don't really have, it's not like I'm like now, on to the next chapter yet. I don't know. I'm seeing how it goes. This is an incredibly challenging experience. I've never worked as hard on something as I have on this. So, and I thought I'd worked really hard.
How did your parents meet?
My parents met, well, you will also read about that if you read the book, but the short answer is they met in the Peace Corps. They met on orientation day for a Peace Corps program. My mom liked to say that she was kind of, she really wanted to get out of the holler, and a couple of events happened that kind of pushed her out of the holler. Pushed is the right word. She got herself out of the holler. And she really wanted to see the world. And she's very adventurous and was determined to really get out. My dad was also, this is 1969. My dad was also very determined not to go to Vietnam. And so those, two very also kind of class-oriented sort of elements, class and education oriented elements, and also gendered elements, came together when they met in the Peace Corps. And they, the two of them are, I shouldn't say there's somebody who's in the audience who might be one of them, but are, that I think that, people have said, oh, was there so much, what was that like being, with two very different people? They've always been kind of, you're your parents, right? So you're like envision them as one thing. But I would say that it's always been, I was never really so conscious of, it wasn't like, my dad said, well, it's Hanukkah. In my family, our tradition is to light a menorah, Anya. And my mom said, well, we don't do that in our family because we are Christian. Like, it wasn't like there was any type of absolute sort of designation. If anything, they just kind of had their own little pod that was, and my sister and I were in the pod. So I wouldn't say that we were raised one way or another, or leaning towards one way or another would be an untruth. But that's how they met. Peace Corps.
I think that one last question. Anybody have one last?
Yeah, Asa.
Anya, in the process of doing this, I assume, how did you manage to write an evocative memoir without lapsing into stereotype or, portraying your relatives from such a different culture as the one you were raised, without it seeming like an anthropological thing? How did you make it like a human element? And more to the point, how did you even sit down and start this? Because if you think about the lapse of a life, there are so many different events, and where was your starting point?
Well, my starting point was I wrote the book backwards.
Okay.
So I started at the end, just to make it extra hard. I started at the end, and my starting point was really, the events that happened at the end, which was exactly what was going on in the present of my life, or what was the recent past of what was going on in my life. And to the extent that I had a plan for anything, I thought I was just going to stay in that. But when I started, showing it to other people in that class, in that community class, people would say, well, why did this happen? Or they were very curious about certain aspects, and they would say, well, could we hear more about this? Or, maybe it would be interesting to hear, why this happened. And so slowly I started going back and back and back, and then eventually sort of landing in the kind of what I wanted to do was the series of very troubling and upsetting things had happened. And I really wanted to figure out to treat it like a problem, like you would if you had a calculus problem. Like, why did this happen? And what could I do? What could I have foreseen or changed why this happened? Of those mistakes, were those mistakes along the way? And so I kind of tried to use the writing as a way to go backwards and to see what were the origins of that. What was the, if I went back and looked at this, was there something there? Was there something there? And so that brought me, I think, back to the point where the story starts. But specifically about stereotypes, I mean, I never experienced my family as stereotypes.
Exactly, so how did you manage not to have any of that come into your writing?
Well, I just explore them as the people I knew, you know, which means I think neither over, I mean, it also includes not over romanticizing them. So not also saying, you know, these are these, you know, flawless people who are totally misinterpreted and who there's no basis for saying that they, you know, don't have everybody's got something wrong with them, right? So my grandmother, for instance, I love very dearly and is a beautiful person, but she has some flaws, and her flaws were things that were very, very difficult to deal with. And they were also, I have flaws. I mean, I think that's very clear in the book. And just because somebody has flaws doesn't mean you don't love them. And one of the things that I tried to do was, and this was some advice I was given by a writer named Nick Flynn, was to examine myself and to make he said, you know, to make yourself the villain in the book. And to try to examine the ways in which it might be your perception. What are you doing that could be causing you to see that person's actions that get them that perception? And although that might seem like, you know, self-flagellation or something, it's actually a very interesting way to kind of proceed writing a book. The other thing that I think was very important to me was when I started writing this book was also when Hillbilly Elegy came out. And so, you know, a lot of this, I think subconsciously was my response to that, which is that book to me felt very, I mean, any book that is monolithic about a perspective, particularly about hillbillies, and particularly sort of that led to the blame of, you know, this is an explanation for the election, that I felt very, very upset about. And so to me, as with my riposte has always been, look at it from the most personal place you can. And so to me, like, make Mamaw alive on the page so that other people feel like they know her. And that doesn't involve stereotype, but does Mamaw speak with a very, you know, thick Southern accent that is also thick East Kentucky specific to Breathitt County accent? Yes. Does she have some, you know, areas in which some people might say she's ignorant? Yes. So I think just being very specific and really treating them like the humans they are.